Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, or good middle of the night, depending on where you are, and welcome to Enabling Autonomous Cybersecurity. I am Elizabeth Bramson-Boudreau, CEO and publisher at MIT Technology Review. Our program today is presented by MIT Technology Review in partnership with Darktrace. Enabling Autonomous Cybersecurity offers a look at advances in artificial intelligence in the field of cybersecurity, both on the offensive and the defensive side. The event is organized as two one-hour episodes with a 25-minute break in between for an interactive Q&A session. We open the program with a window into the work of researchers, development teams, and practitioners who are at the cutting edge of AI research, optimizing cyber AI technology to keep pace with the present and evolving cyber threat landscape. The premise of our conversations is a recognition that the frequency and ferocity of cyber attacks continues to move beyond a size and scale that humans can address, and every business is vulnerable to this new reality. So we examine the ways technology can help with this challenge. I think the timing of this program is really important. This past year has brought its own set of challenges, of course, keeping remote workforces secure, managing mounting risk across disparate digital environments, and even defending critical infrastructure from nation-state attacks. And so with that, let's begin. It is my great pleasure to welcome our first speaker, Nicole Egan, Chief Strategy and AI Officer at Darktrace, and our second, Jack Stockdale, CTO at Darktrace. They will offer a glimpse under the hood at how AI is both driving and thwarting cyber attacks. This session is pre-recorded, but Nicole will be live to answer your questions in the Q&A that's scheduled just after 1 o'clock Eastern Time. You can submit questions in any of the sessions in episode 1 in the chat, and Nicole and the other speakers will address as many as possible. Please add question in all caps to begin your submission in the chat because it can get very noisy in there. We want to be able to find your questions. One final housekeeping note. I want to call your attention to the polls tab, which is located next to the chat box, and invite you to answer the questions as the program unfolds. Okay, over to the video for our very first session.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for that intro. I'm Nicole Egan, Chief Strategy Officer, and joining me today is Darktrace Chief Technology Officer, Jack Stockdale. Hi, Jack.
Hi, Nicole. Thank you. Great to be here.
We'd like to talk to you about the next generation of cyber attacks and how AI is both driving and defending against these attacks. Cybersecurity has continually been evolving, but I think it's really reached a watershed moment where we've moved into a whole new era of both attack and defense. It's really reached a point of reckoning, one that is further bolstering AI approaches in a big way, mainly because the threat drivers are forever changing. So as this new era is ushered in, it really means that there is a new opportunity to rewire how people are thinking about cyber defense. And this means that a fundamentally different approach is necessary. So there is an urgent need as well as an enormous opportunity for all of us working in AI and machine learning to rewire how people think about cyber defense. So what Darktrace has done is created a fundamentally different approach. So we have a system that actually goes into the business and learns how business normally operates, not just the machines and the processes, but also the people and how they interact with each other as well as those machines. And it has to constantly adapt. As the business changes, the understanding from the machine learning has to constantly change. And once it understands normal, it can actually spot these new and novel attacks, often referred to as zero-day attacks, as well as novel attacks from insiders, such as insider threat. But most importantly, it doesn't only detect these, but it autonomously responds. And this is really important because as the attacks evolve, you have to have a new type of defense. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to Jack Stockdale to talk about the evolution of the attack.
Thanks, Nicole. We're absolutely in the world now of AI-driven attacks. Thankfully, there's a whole suite of AI defenses to deal with those, particularly sort of fast-moving evolving attacks that are designed to blend in with the business and really sort of hide under the radar. And AI attacks can be very slow and stealthy, very difficult to spot, or they can be massively damaging and move at such speed that the human teams can't really deal with them. It's possible now to go on the dark web and download AI attack toolkits, so you don't even need to be an AI expert to launch these. But we're really worried about where the AI attacking is going in the future. But certainly today, it's really human beings that are the weak link in many breaches and many threats our customers face. It's absolutely not a fair game using AI attacks against humans. These are normal employees who are going about their business. They're doctors or nurses or bankers. They're not experts in cybersecurity, and yet they're on the front line. So in Darktrace, we've been doing lots of research really into AI attacks. We fundamentally believe you can't defend against AI attacks without understanding how they work. And so as a byproduct, we've become experts really in what goes into an AI attack. And we're using those now in our R&D labs to really pit AI defense and AI attacks against each other. And as you do that, and as they learn from each other and evolve from each other, not only does our Darktrace defensive AI get better, but actually the AI attacks get better as well. And we've done really lots of work looking at how the AI attacks are impacting human beings. And done a lot of research, and we're building that into a product actually, which is going to really help that process of continually testing and checking your employees to make sure they're following basic cyber hygiene. What I want to show you now is one of those research projects we've done internally. So in this case, basically what we did is use entirely publicly available video recordings and voice recordings of Nicole taken from the public web. You only need about 20 minutes of these voice recordings, and then we used Nicole's voice essentially to build an AI model to sound like Nicole, and to see if we can use that to sort of mount the first stage of a simulated attack against people, and see how realistic we can use this sort of deepfake technology. The R&D team actually used some unsuspecting people across the business to see how they'd react when presented with a voice call. I'll show you, we'll listen to the voice call now. The important thing to realize is this is very easy to produce with publicly available voice, and unfortunately, actually, as you'll hear, if this was a genuine attack, would have succeeded.
Hey, IT support. It's Nicole Egan.
Hi.
I'm in the UK for an important meeting, and I'm afraid I knocked my phone off the table and smashed the screen.
No. So are you able to get into it? I guess probably.
I've had to borrow the taxi driver's phone to ring you guys, but luckily my laptop is still logged in, so I could get your number. Can I get a replacement phone from the London office, please?
Yeah, we should be able to get one to you. So is the are you needing your phone to sign in, or like what's the scenario there?
Yeah. Yes. In the meantime, can I get a bypass code for the Do Authenticator, please?
So as you heard there, successful, and I've known Nicole for a long time, and you can probably tell that's not, if you really know Nicole very well, you may have doubts, but the point here is that people aren't suspecting and they're not on the lookout. And so whether it's deepfake voices or deepfake videos appearing in your video chat programs, unless you're in a mindset to be looking out for something, the trust you place in technology and talking to people who you're familiar with means that humans are susceptible to these sort of attacks and techniques, and we're starting to see these in use in the sophisticated threats across the industry already. And as I said before, it's very low barrier to entry, and as always, the attacker only needs to succeed once, and to defend, we have to be able to catch this every single time. Fundamentally in Darktrace, we take an approach that you can't build AI models in the lab and distribute those out to the real world and expect those to work in the real world. For a start, finding the right training data is an extremely hard problem, notoriously hard in machine learning and AI. But even if you do manage to find the ideal training set that represents every threat or every problem a business could face, when you build these models in the lab and you convince yourselves that from testing and percentages that they work very well, the danger then is when you put them in the real world doesn't look like your lab. Not only that, one part of the real world doesn't look like another part of the real world. And so they fundamentally fall down with the amount of real data that they see in the real world. And really not only that, you always have to keep updating them because attacks change, threats change, businesses change. Again, building in the lab, you're really having to regularly and repeatedly build these models and send them out to the real world to try and keep up with the changing attack surface. So we've totally changed that philosophy around. And we use two phrases really in Darktrace. One is self-learning. And so that's the ability for our technology to go and learn for itself from a business rather than relying on training data from past attacks. But the other phrase is learning self, and that's really what our technology is doing within a business. It's learning what is unique about that business, what the people in that business do, what the systems do, normal operations, and from that we can start to spot, we start to learn self for that organization. And once you've learned self, you can start to spot things that don't fit in with that self. And we use the analogy of the immune system, and that's very much like how the human immune system works. It recognizes their own body, it recognizes self, and from that it can start to spot unknown invaders that don't match self. Using self-learning and the ability to really know what self is for an organization and spot things that don't match enables us to use AI to mount truly autonomous defenses. So this is an AI system choosing how to respond and contain a threat or potential threat for completely unknown and unseen before threats and attacks hitting a business. You can only really do this with true self-learning AI. So this isn't about running standard playbooks or rules or scripts that a human being has designed beforehand to counteract a threat. This is an AI system deciding for itself with the options available to it to impact user accounts or systems connecting to other systems or a threat spreading laterally through the network or reaching out to parts of the internet, to really stop threats at a very early stage, totally from looking at how they deviate from sort of the normal self. So back over to Nicole now.
Thanks, Jack. Yeah, I think the last piece you just talked about, the autonomous response, is so very important. And similar to self-learning, I think it's a absolute real game changer. And I think when you take a step back, it's so important because here what you're doing is you're actually talking about not only analyzing data, but most importantly, it is actually making decisions and taking actions. And that is so fundamentally different than playbooks or anything else out there that's much more automated and not autonomous. And that moves us on to the next area, which is AI native. You know, when you decide that you're not going to learn in a lab and you're going to take a self-learning approach, it really then comes down to architecture. You have to make sure that you're actually seeing the data at its rawest, most real-time level in order for this approach to fundamentally work. And I think one of the things we've seen is people say, well, okay, that's great. Can't we just, plug something in on top of an existing system or an existing data repository? And the answer is no. You actually would have to architect from the ground up in this AI native real raw data kind of mechanism. So that is very different than what else we've seen out there. I think the next piece is really, where does this go next? Once you have the ability, we started with that ability to learn self, as Jack talked about. We then moved into the ability, once you can detect those earliest stages of threats, to be able to autonomously respond to them, augmenting the human teams. But we think there's more. We think that the next logical step is going to actually be able to use that understanding of self and understanding knowledge of the attack to actually self-heal the infrastructure. And that really gets almost into the area, sometimes people talk about things like AI, IT ops, but we actually think that security will subsume that space, because it makes sense that you need to be able to have these self-healing systems after an attack happens. And then eventually, we think the next stage would be to actually be able to feed in data to start to prevent these attacks. So actually get into AI-based penetration testing and things like AI-based attack path modeling. So that's the final phase. And what this forms an entire closed loop system where each phase of the AI learns and gets stronger and better from the previous phase. And that's what we think the eventual panacea will be in terms of AI-based cyber defense. So hopefully with this, Jack and I have been able to kind of bring you up to speed on what we think is happening in terms of machine learning and AI-based attacks, and also, most importantly, how we can defend against them. And I think what also is important is the technology we've described and shown here today is in use actually by over 4,500 different companies of all sizes across all industries. And they've been able to get this working kind of out of the box without any human intervention to set it up or to train systems. And it's a real practical, straightforward approach, although it's based on very sophisticated technology under the hood. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was great, Nicole and Jack. I've spoken to Nicole a couple of times, and I definitely could not tell that wasn't her voice. So later in the program, Mike Beck is going to pick up on this thread and share more about how AI is augmenting human security teams. Next, we introduce the research side of cyber AI. I invite you to a unique session that will illustrate some of the work going on in two world-class laboratories on cyber research, one at Darktrace and the other at MIT. We are pleased, again, to welcome Chief Strategy and AI Officer at Darktrace, Nicole Egan, and Jack Stockdale, CTO at Darktrace, along with Una May.
If we can, the best people in the world, often straight out of universities. So a lot of sort of PhD people based all in Cambridge in the UK. We have great links to a number of universities. And this is truly cutting edge. This is, you can't search for the answer if you can't solve some of this problem. So the willingness to allow these teams to try things, and sometimes they fail, which is fine, and sometimes they produce amazing research projects. And typically it takes sort of 12 to 18 months before new research products find their way into the products, the products we ship to customers. So today's research really is tomorrow's product, and that's really seen us well in Darktrace over the last 8 years. And you can sort of look at the sort of regular cadence of customer products we have built on some of the research ideas and projects that come out of that core research team, and we really think that produces some compelling end products for our customers.
Excellent. And now, Una May, we've got the Cambridge to Cambridge link. So maybe talk a little bit about the type of research that you've got going on at MIT, based in Cambridge, Massachusetts.
That's right. So I work in the Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Lab at MIT. It's a community of over 100 principal investigators. So each one of us is leading a research group, and I lead a group that is named Alpha, Any-Scale Learning for All. And it's much smaller, I think, than Darktrace's. It's composed of PhD students and postdocs. I have a research staff member, And as well, we have this great ingredient coming from the fact that MIT runs undergraduate research opportunities. So we actually welcome undergraduates, and we start working with them from that time in their academic career on research problems. So what this allows me to do is to set my own agenda. I have a lot of autonomy, and I'm right now really passionate about adversarial behavior. I'm interested in how the intelligent aspects of adversarial behavior, which are, part of which are learning, and that I can simulate with machine learning with my computer algorithms. I'm interested in how adversarial behavior interacts between different adversaries and the dynamics around that. So we work on projects more in the scope of 2 to 5 to 10 years. We get given projects from research agencies that say to us, work on the hardest problem with the longest vision. And I ask my students to work on things that are relevant and hard. And our output is publications. So we try and take up research questions, work on them, validate our contributions from them, and then publish them to share them with the rest of the world.
Excellent. That's great. So similarities, I think, in a lot of the profile of the people that you have in your research environments, and in some cases maybe some complementary research as well. So Jack, one of the initial kind of big research projects that you started on was trying to actually emulate the human body's own immune system as a way to detect and autonomously respond to cyber attacks. Can you share with us maybe some of the research principles? I know it's a very broad and large topic, but maybe you can share some of the highlights of that research.
Yeah, I mean, fundamentally, when we set out in Darktrace, looking to use machine learning and AI, as many people finding training sets to build sort of supervised models, which is even now really seen as sort of a fairly standard way of doing machine learning. Those training sets just don't exist, and so we were almost forced at the beginning to turn things round. And our philosophy from the very beginning was, rather than sort of train an AI system to know everything it needs to know to counteract threats, instead we set out to build a system that we almost give no knowledge to at all, but we allow it to learn itself. And so the ability for exactly the same AI to be put into any environment, whether that's a bank or a satellite or a robotics floor or even a semi-autonomous ship sailing over the seas, and have it learn from that environment and start to really learn what self means for that particular environment, whether that's the people or the processes or the systems. And so we talk a lot internally in Darktrace about this pattern of life. So we build models from the data itself and build up what we call a pattern of life for really every entity on the system, whether that's a person or whether that's a device, or a person as expressed through their iPhone and their laptop, or if it's a industrial context, maybe that's a switch or a robot, and use self-learning, unsupervised AI and machine learning to build these models of self and do lots of sort of peer group analysis, so you can start to spot perhaps one in a peer group which is acting differently to the rest of the peers. But that fundamental switching around, rather than sort of looking for an attack, we get to know the business. And much like we model it on the immune system, which is very much how the immune system works, it works by learning what self looks like internally to us. And that same philosophy, that once you know self, you can start to spot anything that doesn't belong to that self. And we use that, any data point really outside that pattern of life as an indication of the very earliest indication of a compromise. And so it's a totally different way of thinking about the problem, not looking for threats and not trying to build models that will find particular attacks or particular malware or particular types of attack, but instead use that ability to spot anything that doesn't really belong. And then there's the obvious problem that obviously people change all the time and systems change all the time. So it's actually not that difficult spotting changes. The difficulty is contextualizing that and seeing if a particular change could be a threat. And if we can determine that there's a potential for threat there, then what we can do about that, sort of stop it or contain it. And that's where we bring this autonomous response. And so allowing the machine learning and AI to interact directly with systems if it does spot something that's not part of what it thinks is normal in self, essentially to bring the data back into the normal pattern of life. So if we spot a login or a piece of data being sent around or connections that we don't think are part of that self and could be a threat, then allow the machine learning to step in and actually interrupt that actual activity to contain a threat, and allowing the human teams to look into it and contextualize and get the head around what's happening. But as we know, machine speed attacks need that machine speed response. And so that's our fundamental approach of Darktrace.
Great. And Uname, we've talked before about some of your research projects. Some of them you've kind of let attackers and defenders kind of fight against each other. You've also done some interesting projects around advanced persistent threat, or APT mapping. What research project would you like to share with the audience?
Well, I'd like to start by sort of emphasizing my interest in the dynamics of adversaries and how they react to each other and ratchet up their skills into this sort of continuously evolving arms race. And sometimes I use machine learning techniques driven by data because I'm interested in whether machine learning models themselves can be attacked. But other times I resort to a metaphor that's in parallel to the immune system that Darktrace is using. I think about coevolution. I think about how in biology, populations of predators and prey co-evolve. And I map those populations of predators to attackers and those populations of prey to defenses. And in the algorithms I use, I actually simulate the evolutionary dynamics of populations competing against each other, and then by means of genetic inheritance and survival of the fittest, these populations adapting over time to each other. And I really do take coevolution in biology very accurately in the algorithms I use. So what we've been doing is in a project we have where we're considering one part in the kill chain of an advanced persistent threat. We have a population of attackers who have already penetrated into a network. And in this software-defined network, they're trying to scan the network in a reconnaissance, for reconnaissance purposes, to map the network. And we actually run these scans against a population of defensive configurations on the network as some sort of mission is running on the network. So what we get is the dynamics of a scan versus a defense. And we collect the outcomes of these different engagements across the network, with the network as the engagement space. And we use the feedback, the quality of the performance for an attacker, a scanner, or for a defender, and we use that feedback to evolve each one independently, but with respect to each other. And what emerges from that is what you may not anticipate, right? You're allowed to now not, as a security stance, as opposed to being reactive, these simulations of adaptive behavior between attackers and defenders allows you to anticipate what could happen. And you kind of get to, with our tools, play a what if. What if I change this? How bad would the attacks be, or how many attacks could I shut down? So that's kind of the nature of the work, and it's really interesting that we follow an evolutionary metaphor, and Darktrace is following one from immune systems, another biological system.
Exactly. The biological linkages are really interesting. And similarly, another thing that I picked up about both of the principles or approaches is that you're both assuming, and now as particular research scenarios, that the attacker's already gotten inside. And that in itself is a leap forward from the rest of the industry, which still in many ways is kind of trying to use protective layers and detect when people are breaking in. So the other thing that Uname just touched on, Jack, was this idea of kind of simulations, right? And being able to get into the more predictive nature. You have a research project right now, I think, around attack path modeling that is probably a great follow-on to Una May. Maybe you can discuss that for a minute.
Yeah. So the general idea of attack path modeling is essentially to be able to take any attack at any point, and if it was stopped, really predict how it may have played out or could have played out. And we use that. There's a number of different purposes actually. A lot of the reasons we use that actually is actually Darktrace technology is very successful, and one of its greatest problems as a company is it can be too good. And so if it stops attacks very early and finds things and does so reliably and routinely, then showing the value and ensuring that people see what it's doing is essential. And we use attack path modeling for that really. And so to be able to predict if autonomous response hadn't stepped in, then what would have happened. But we're actually also using it now in more of a sort of an AI-driven red teaming context, and we're going to allow the technology to sort of impact sort of the first few stages of attack and maybe get the user and the humans to click a link or open attachment. And really interested in attacking the humans. We think humans are a weak point. But the attack path modeling allows us then to simulate how bad that would have been, and it allows us to do red teaming without really hitting the networks. And so there's a lot of uses for this technique.
Excellent. Well, we're running out of time, but thank you so much, both to Una May and to Jack Stockdale. Thanks very much for sharing some insights from your R&D labs.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you again, Nicole and Jack, and thank you, Una May. I think you'll find that our final session in this very first episode is going to be especially compelling. Eloy Avila is America's CTO at Darktrace, and he will be talking with Nick Perota, the Chief Digital and Information Officer at Harman International, which is a subsidiary of Samsung. As CDIO, Nick is responsible, among many other duties, for driving cyber protection across the company. They're going to address how to balance the pursuit of data-driven digital expansion while mitigating risk to tackle the challenges of sharing and connectivity. Eloy and Nick, welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks, Elizabeth.
It is all yours.
Thank you, Elizabeth, again. I'm speaking here with Nick Perota, the Chief Digital Information Officer at Harman International. Welcome, Nick. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Eloy, and thanks to Elizabeth and MIT as well for the opportunity to share a little bit of our thoughts around our digital story at Harman. And it's great to be with you, and I hope all is well with all of our listeners.
Great. And Nick, I'd like to start by asking you to describe Harman International's position in the mobility market, as well as your role. I think it will be great context for a conversation here.
Sure. So as Elizabeth mentioned, Harman's a wholly owned subsidiary of Samsung. So 30,000 employees across the world that have a passion and a purpose to design and deliver innovative connected experiences in the home, on the go, and of course in the car. And really focused on providing a seamless, integrated, frictionless experience. With respect to our automotive division, we partner with major OEMs to deliver an immersive connected experience, an integrated ecosystem of hardware, software, and services. So some of those services and hardware and software are in the digital cockpit, or what would be considered the infotainment area. We provide advanced driver assistance systems as well. We provide telematics or over-the-air updates. We have a cloud-based application services product called Ignite. And of course, for those who are familiar with our lifestyle and consumer audio, we also have fantastic car premium audio, such as Harman Kardon and Bang & Olufsen, JBL, Mark Levinson, and Rebel. But of course, what we're here to talk about today is cyber protection, and we do provide cyber protection in vehicle as well. As the Chief Digital Information Officer, I'm responsible for providing strategic vision, digital enablement, operational excellence, as well as enterprise risk and cyber for the company. Most importantly, I have the responsibility and great privilege to help build and develop talented teams in our digital organization. And then lastly, I look at ways to help extend our capabilities with our teams in cloud and artificial intelligence and in cyber into our products. And so this is where our opportunity to partner with Darktrace continues to evolve. So lastly, I would say that in the automotive space, we're looking at a very connected ecosystem of 5G, cloud, edge, autonomous, and data. From now till 2030, we'll have a really significant growth in connected automobiles from 48% to 96%. And we'll have a significant, massive growth in data from the vehicle to the cloud. Today, it's about 30,000 petabytes of data. The reason why I know this, of course, Eloy, is I also champion our Experience Per Mile Advisory Council, which you were part of, 25 plus digital thought leaders that recently produced a white paper around connected, autonomous, shared, and electrified, and provides kind of what the outlook of 2030 is going to look like from an automotive and mobile as a service industry.
Yeah, thanks, Vic. I'm glad you brought up EPM, because I think CASE, or connected, autonomous, shared, and electrification is really what encompasses a lot of this shift in the industry. And this, maybe we can explore some of this. We're seeing this shift from yesterday's use of sensor technology in cars to vehicle telematics today. You mentioned the digital cockpit, 5G connectivity, for example. Can you tell us a bit more about that and why security is so critical, really an integral facet of innovation in the industry now and in the future?
Yeah, I think with connected vehicles and mobility as a service, that means increased attack surfaces from the hardware, software, and services. So from cloud to networked operating systems, application, and the endpoint, it is very similar to what we're dealing with in the enterprise today in terms of how we think about protecting the product. And of course, data is a very important part of the product as well. When you look at where the customers and OEMs are moving toward with CASE, and in particular this experience, you're going to need data, and that data has to be protected. So providing a level of ease of use and this integrated seamless experience, whether that's for entertainment or social or gaming or even a workplace on wheels, being able to provide autonomous connected experiences through these personas, but still protecting the data is going to be incredibly important. So, of course, we see this in the enterprise already. When you look at the importance around new privacy protection laws like GDPR in Europe and CCPA, these are going to continue to evolve and require us to have a level of support and adherence to protect the data and to ensure that we have digital trust with customers. In addition, you see continued focus on compliance and being able to ensure that going from the design to supply chain to the product is done in a very robust and secure way. So things like the Trusted Information Security Access Exchange, which is similar to ISO, we need to make sure from an automotive perspective that we're meeting those standards in the industry, similar to ISO 27001, which we are also certified. So again, with all of this connected experiences, we're going to need to continue to provide robust real-time mitigations.
It's amazing. I think one of the stats that we looked at in EPM and kind of going off of that, you mentioned a data point, the 30,000 petabytes of data that connected cars are producing nowadays. I've heard stats of 280 plus million connected cars nowadays. That growing to 96% of vehicles in the next within the next decade. Obviously, that's an enormous amount of data, but to put it into context for some of our listeners here and viewers, that compares to, I think it's 50 petabytes. That is the entire record of written human history. So we're producing a vast amount of data. These cars are using this data not only for interpreting and navigating the world, but providing experiences as well, and increasingly are sharing this data. So it's important to consider, and I think not everyone looks at automobiles as data privacy pain points, especially now with, you mentioned GDPR, CCPA. I think there's a new UN regulation as well on software updates and over-the-air updates. One of those areas that we're focusing on with the EPM Council is the user experience and how that's increasingly more important than maybe traditional automobile features that consumers are looking at. where do things like biometrics fit into tomorrow's cars, and how do you provide that personal experience while protecting personal data and privacy? Talking about these regulations.
Yeah, biometrics is going to be a really interesting dynamic and evolution when it comes to securing the vehicle. I think from an access controls perspective, being able to provide a car key that involves techniques to eliminate things like impersonation or securing PII information or personally identifiable information, especially in a shared mobility, as we talked about the notion that the growth in the shared mobility will continue to increase. Being able to provide a level of authentication, encryption, anonymization in the data, and also to be able to provide sort of a one-button wipe of the data is going to be increasingly important in the evolution of the data and as it pertains to either personal vehicles or shared mobility. So I think we've got, obviously a lot of interesting things happening with biometrics, both, fingerprint, eye scan, face recognition. We're doing a lot of that, of course, on the mobile devices today. But that notion to be able to use that same functionality in a vehicle and the interaction in the vehicle, I think we'll continue to see evolve.
Yeah, and we've seen examples, I think, of maybe early applications of that with data sharing. And as we increasingly get to a point where maybe sole car ownership isn't the norm, we've heard kids nowadays maybe not even bothering to get their driver's license, for example. And one of those examples that I heard in the last couple of years is users that maybe had access to a vehicle, had their data managed, and maybe even access to the vehicle, being able to start it and whatnot through an app, returning that vehicle to a dealer, and then maybe a year or two down the road, still being able to access that when it's moved on to another owner. So lots of interesting use cases. We've had cases where we've seen connected vehicles parked in parking lots accessing corporate networks, for example. So a huge attack surface across the board. But maybe coming back to the use of AI here and machine learning, how do you see the industry and Harman looking at using the same sort of AI approaches that are used to help vehicles navigate and understand the physical world? Can you give us a sense how AI might be used to applied or to use for these fronts as well?
Sure. I can start with our experience with Darktrace. We implemented Darktrace in December 2019 and found that it was a very different type of technology that we added to our portfolio of cybersecurity capabilities. Deploying the appliances in some of our major data centers like Chicago, Munich, Mumbai, and getting to get a very good sense of how the AI engine worked. The notion that it would collect these patterns of life, we're up to 48 million patterns of life with about 100 terabytes of data per day. Being able to look at anomalies is incredibly important to us. What we found is the ability to provide kind of these unique, unexpected, unique scenarios that are a little bit different from the configured policy-based vulnerabilities has really transformed the way we also monitor, manage, and mitigate risk within the enterprise. We believe that there is an opportunity to extend that when you look at from an IoT and endpoint perspective. We view the vehicle as just another endpoint. While it's a very complicated endpoint with a lot of technology in the vehicle, the ability to provide a level of understanding of what's happening in the ecosystem based on these patterns of life at the endpoint is something that is very unique. And so being able to provide a view into your network operation center, your security operation center, and all of the assets within it and how it's performing based on these patterns of life is something that we find really intriguing when it comes to automotive. Now, I know the cyber risks are also evolving. So when you look at some of the recent ransomware, such as Ryak and Tortoise, they are adapting themselves as well. So being able to have an AI security tool that uses artificial intelligence to identify these anomalies is going to continue to be important. Again, whether it's a laptop, a tablet, a mobile phone, or an autonomous vehicle, this capability is going to be incredibly important. One of the things we take great interest in and what you're doing, and I'm sure you'd be interested in sharing, but what Darktrace is doing with McLaren, which is a great use case and example of how the automotive industry is using AI today.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. And I guess I should mention, because it's public for those of you interested in visiting the EPM site, McLaren's a wonderful customer and partner of Darktrace, is also an EPM member. And as a customer, we've got the pleasure of working closely with them across both their IT side of the business and securing their traditional IT systems, but they're also a racing team. And so we get to help them with these mobile race teams that pack and go and set up a racetrack whenever there's that happening, the various edge compute systems supporting those race teams, and even the telemetry data coming out of these cars, which is pretty incredible. As they're racing around the track, we are oftentimes deployed side by side and adapting to those networks that are often changing, whether it's the sensors and the network on the vehicle or the network supporting the race teams and the infrastructure. Darktrace is applied in the same environment, adapts very quickly, and helps them detect and respond very quickly to anomalies that may be disruptive of that race or the team or their business. We're also applying the same approach to their email ecosystem. McLaren, as with most of our customers and really the industry as a whole, are seeing a surge in email-borne attacks, so phishing sort of links and attacks, especially with all of us now remote working and most of our customers adapting to that. So we're protecting them across the board. But I also wanted to, because speaking about McLaren and the race cars on there, it's fascinating to me that I've heard some stats that autonomous cars nowadays have more coding than fighter jets, for example. And I don't think a lot of the consumers getting into their cars, connecting their phone, realize how complex some of these networks are, with hundreds of sensors, very complex networks, edge services providing the sort of voice services that they're using, increasingly smart cities. So it's a really interesting sort of dynamic and a fast-moving ecosystem. You probably get asked this a great deal, Nick, but maybe you can help us paint a picture of mobility for 2030 in your eyes.
Yeah, well, thankfully, I have a lot of smart people around me, including you and the folks that are on the EPM Council, to help me answer that question, because I honestly would have a very difficult time answering it myself. But clearly, the connected, autonomous, shared, and electrification of the mobile as a service is continuing to grow. We see that as we've talked even today with the continued growth. And certainly the convergence of 5G capabilities, cloud, edge, artificial intelligence, and autonomous is going to continue to help that growth. But as you mentioned, we're also going to see a lot of additional attack surfaces that we're going to have to protect. If you look at how the evolution of RPM to EPM, this experience per mile, will continue to evolve, that really takes advantage of all of these convergence of technologies. So the ability to go from your home to the car on the go will be able to take advantage of, whether you like social or gaming or workplace mobility on a workplace in the mobility setting. And as you go from a level 1 to a level 5 in autonomous, it's going to free up a lot more capabilities and a lot more flexibility in terms of how you use that vehicle. But again, all of that comes with the need to really protect the data, the car, in a way that we haven't ever seen. And so when you're looking at vehicle to infrastructure, vehicle to vehicle, vehicle to cloud, and vehicle to pedestrian, which you have the ability to have in 2030 with smart cities and with this amazing convergence of technology, you can't get all of this without making sure that you're securing all those aspects. So we continue to see a lot of exciting things happening with respect to the mobility as a service industry. And we certainly know that there's going to be a lot more continued efforts around managing the cyber security in every one of those elements.
Great, thanks, Nick. I think one of those areas that is sometimes forgotten about is the complexity of this ecosystem as it evolves. To me, it's an increase in cloud adoption, in software-driven, data-driven experiences, consumers expecting more of that fluid connectivity and that experience that takes them from their office at work, their home, into their vehicle, and seamless understanding of who they are, what their preferences are, what they're trying to do, what they're trying to achieve, and driving that. And a very vast ecosystem supporting that, whether it's edge, cloud, smart cities, a vast supply chain of components that go into that. So I think we're bound for an exciting next decade. Didn't hear any flying cars quite there in the prediction yet, but I'm hoping to eventually get to that point. So thank you, Nick. I think this wraps up our session with Nick Perrotta, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I think we'll see everyone in the Q&A session coming up in a few minutes. And then over back to you, Elizabeth.
Great. Thank you very much. That was a great conversation. So we will see you in just a minute in the Q&A. So to get to the Q&A, please navigate back to the agenda in this platform and click to join the next session. It's entitled Audience Q&A. And there you'll see Nicole, Eloy, and Nick available to respond to your questions through the live chat. I'll see you back here just after 1:30. Do bear in mind that the speakers need to log off this platform and log on to a different platform to get into the Q&A, so just be patient with them. It takes a few moments to switch over and get into the conversation in the chat. Thanks, and see you at 1:30.